I'm Norm Abram. Welcome to the New Yankee Workshop. Recently we were in Low Country, Savannah, Georgia. Some friends showed me an antique desk. They call it a planter's desk. I think you're going to like it, and we're going to build one today right here.
For 21 years, the hum of the Delta Unisaw was the heartbeat of Saturday afternoon television. It was a world of sawdust, biscuit joiners, and the most famous plaid shirt in history. But in 2009, the barn doors slid shut for the last time, leaving a void that no YouTube creator has truly filled. Was it a hidden health crisis, a corporate fallout, or did the master carpenter simply run out of things to build? The truth is far more complex. Why the sawdust stopped flying? Yes, the truth is far more complex than a simple retirement. It was the collapse of a woodworking empire at the intersection of a global economic crisis and the exhaustion of a legend. The end of the New Yankee Workshop didn't arrive with a dramatic series finale or a tearful goodbye. Instead, it was a quiet fade to black that left millions of hobbyists wondering what happened to their weekend mentor. Should we blame Climate 2009 for the ending of the show? Truth be told, the world was reeling from the Great Recession. The housing market, the very foundation upon which the DIY industry was built, had cratered. For a show that relied heavily on high-end corporate sponsorships from tool giants like Delta, Porter Cable, and Vermont American, the financial floor simply dropped out. Marketing budgets in the power tool sector vanished overnight as construction halted across America. Without the influx of sponsorship dollars to fund the high production values of WGBH Boston, the show's math no longer added up. But money was only the catalyst. The fuel was burnout. By the time the final season wrapped, Norm Abram had been the face of two major television franchises simultaneously for over 2 decades. While most TV personalities manage one 30-minute slot, Norm was the backbone of this old house, while carrying the entirety of the New Yankee Workshop on his shoulders. People often forget that for every 25-minute episode of New Yankee, there were hundreds of hours of invisible labor. Norm wasn't just showing up and reading a teleprompter. He was building a prototype of every piece of furniture to work out the kinks, then building the production piece on camera, all while drafting the measured drawings that would be sold to fans later. Imagine doing that for 21 seasons, 235 projects ranging from simple birdhouses to museum-quality highboys and roll-top desks. The mental load of being the man who doesn't make mistakes became a heavy burden. Norm was a perfectionist in a medium television that usually rewards shortcuts. He refused to take them. By 2009, he was 59 years old. He had spent his entire adult life under the hot glow of studio lights and the fine dust of a workshop. He didn't want to wait until the show became a parody of itself. He wanted to while he was still the undisputed gold standard of the craft. There was also a subtle, shifting tide in the media landscape. In 2009, a little platform called YouTube was beginning to move past cat videos and into the realm of instructional content. The old guard of PBS felt the pressure of a new generation that wanted faster, snappier, and perhaps less perfect content. Producer Russell Morash, the visionary who essentially invented the how-to genre with Julia Child and The Victory Garden, saw the writing on the wall. The era of the high-production hobby show was being challenged by the democratization of video. Rather than compromising the show's integrity or stripping down the workshop to fit a dwindling budget, the team made the executive decision to preserve the legacy. They chose to let the show exist as a completed, pristine library of work rather than a declining series. The tragedy people often search for wasn't a singular event, but the slow realization that an era of craftsmanship-focused television was concluding. Norm didn't leave because he lost his passion for wood. He left because the machinery of television production had finally become more taxing than the woodworking itself. He stayed on with This Old House because it allowed him to be part of a team, sharing the load with Tom Silva and Richard Trethewey, rather than carrying a solo show where every cut, Every measurement and every word rested on him. It was a strategic retreat, a controlled burn of his career that allowed him to focus on what he loved without the crushing weight of a solo production schedule. When the final episode aired, it wasn't a funeral, it was a completion. But was it just the money and the fatigue, or was the very soul of the workshop changing in a way that Norm could no longer ignore? A character study of Norm Abram. So why did the new Yankee workshop become a cultural phenomenon? We have to look past the tools and focus on the man standing behind the bench. Norm Abram wasn't your typical television personality. He didn't have the manic energy of a game show host or the polished, artificial sheen of a Hollywood actor. Instead, he possessed a quiet, stoic authority that made him feel like everyone's favorite uncle, the one who actually knew how to fix things. Norm was the man in plaid, a nickname earned by his unwavering commitment to the flannel shirt, which became his unofficial uniform. But that shirt was more than a fashion choice. It was a symbol of blue-collar expertise elevated to an art form. Norm's journey into the American living room was an accident of fate. A local carpenter in the Boston area, he was hired by producer Russell Morash to build a barn on Morash's property. Morash, who had already changed the face of television by bringing Julia Child's Kitchen to the masses, recognized something special in the way Norm worked. He didn't just build, he narrated his process with a calm, methodical clarity. When Morash launched This Old House in 1979, Norm was brought on as the master carpenter. However, it was the spin-off, the new Yankee Workshop, debuting in 1989, that truly allowed Norm to shine. Here, he wasn't just fixing a drafty window or a sagging floor joist. He was creating heirlooms from scratch. What made Norm so compelling was his zen approach to labor. In an era where television was becoming increasingly loud and frantic, Norm was the antidote. He spoke in a soft, steady New England accent, his voice rarely rising even when a piece of expensive mahogany grain didn't cooperate. He became the Bob Ross of wood, turning the act of joinery into a meditative experience. For many viewers, the show wasn't even about the furniture. They weren't ever going to build a Goddard Townsend block-front chest, but they watched anyway, because watching Norm work was therapeutic. He provided a sense of order in a chaotic world. If you followed the steps, used the jigs, and respected the wood, things would turn out right. Norm's persona was built on the foundation of competence as charisma. He didn't need jokes or catchphrases, though safety first and championship certainly became his trademarks. His charisma came from the fact that he was genuinely world-class levels of good at his job. There was no TV magic where an assistant finished the project behind the scenes. If Norm was shown cutting a dovetail, he was cutting that dovetail. This authenticity created a deep bond of trust with the audience. In a world of as-seen-on-TV gimmicks, Norm was the real deal. He represented the American ideal of the craftsman. Humble, hardworking, and infinitely capable. However, being the face of woodworking came with a unique set of pressures. Norm became the standard-bearer for an entire industry. Every tool he used became an instant bestseller. Every technique he demonstrated became the correct way to do it in garages across the country. This level of influence meant he had to be perfect. One slip of the tongue or one unsafe move on camera would be scrutinized by millions of amateur woodworkers. He carried the responsibility of being the master with grace. But the mental fatigue of maintaining that persona for 21 years was immense. He was a man who preferred the solitude of the grain to the glare of the lens. Yet he stayed in the spotlight because he knew he was helping people discover the joy of creating something with their own two hands. Beneath the flannel shirt and the safety glasses was a man who deeply respected history. Norm often visited museums or historical homes to measure original pieces of furniture, bringing the designs of the 18th and 19th centuries into the modern age. He bridged the gap between the old world masters and the new world hobbyists. He showed that while the tools change, from hand planes to routers, the soul of the work remains the same. He wasn't just a carpenter, he was a teacher who convinced an entire generation that they were capable of more than they realized. He turned the new Yankee from a show title into a mindset, a blend of traditional values and modern efficiency. A master is nothing without his temple, and Norm's temple was a 936-square-foot slice of heaven that every woodworker dreamed of inhabiting. The 936-square-foot shop, a temple of sawdust. To the casual observer, it was just a weathered barn tucked away in a quiet corner of Massachusetts. But to anyone who knew the difference between a mortise and a tenon, that 936-square-foot structure was the most famous workshop to the world. It was the New Yankee Workshop, a space so iconic that its layout is etched into the brains of woodworkers from Maine to Melbourne. This wasn't a Hollywood soundstage with plywood walls and fake lighting. It was a fully functional, living laboratory of sawdust and steel. The shop was located on the property of Russell Morash, the show's creator. Its design was a masterclass in utility, blending the aesthetics of a traditional New England barn with the high-tech requirements of a modern production studio. When you stepped through those sliding barn doors, you weren't just entering a place of work, you were entering a place of logic. Everything had a dedicated spot. The walls were lined with custom-built cabinets and tool racks that Norm had built on camera during the early seasons, effectively making the shop a living museum of its own history. At the center of it all sat the altar, the Delta Unisaw. This massive table saw was the sun around which the entire Yankee universe orbited. Every project started there, and the way the shop was arranged allowed for a seamless workflow that modern shop designers still study today. To the left, you had the assembly area and the massive workbench. To the right, the stationary power tools like the jointer, planer, and the ever-controversial drill press. Toward the back was the finishing room, a small, enclosed space that allowed Norm to apply stains and lacquers without the interference of the dust generated in the main room. What made the shop so captivating was its accessibility. While it eventually housed tens of thousands of dollars in professional machinery, it always felt like a place where a regular person could exist. It wasn't sterile or overly designed. It was dusty. It had scraps of wood in the corners and handwritten notes tacked to the walls. It smelled of pine and finishing wax. The lighting was warm, filtered through the high windows, giving the show a cozy Saturday morning atmosphere that invited the viewer to pull up a stool and stay a while. The workshop was also a character in the show because it evolved. In the early seasons, the shop was relatively sparse, reflecting a more modest, everyman budget. As the show grew in popularity and corporate sponsorships poured in, the shop transformed into an industrial powerhouse. The introduction of the massive sliding table saw and the wide belt sander changed the scale of the projects Norm could tackle. Yet, despite the influx of heavy iron, the shop never lost its soul. It remained a place where the wood was the star. For the fans, the shop was the ultimate escape pod. In a world of cubicles and digital screens, the New Yankee Workshop represented a return to the tactile. It was a place where problems had physical solutions, and where at the end of 30 minutes, something tangible existed that didn't exist before. It was the ultimate man cave before that term became a cliché, but it was inclusive, a place defined by the pursuit of excellence rather than just a collection of tools. It was Norm's sanctuary, but through the lens of the camera, it became ours too. Inside those walls, the tools didn't just cut wood. They redefined the American garage and sparked a debate that still divides the woodworking community today. Power versus purity, the tool debate. If the workshop was the temple, the tools were the icons. And boy, did Norm have a collection that could make a grown man weep. But as the seasons progressed, a quiet tension began to brew within the woodworking community. It was the classic battle of power versus purity. To understand why the New Yankee Workshop was so influential, you have to look at how Norm fundamentally changed the way Americans bought tools. Before Norm, the average hobbyist might have had a circular saw, a rusty hand plane, and a prayer. After Norm, we all suddenly needed a dedicated biscuit joiner and a 3-horsepower shaper. The Norm effect was a very real economic phenomenon. Whenever Norm featured a new piece of kit, hardware stores across the country saw a surge in demand. He was the original influencer, decades before the term existed. One of the most significant game changers he introduced to the masses was the biscuit joiner. Before the show, plate joinery was largely a European professional secret. Norm made it look so effortless, so logical, that he practically single-handedly moved the tool from industrial shops into the suburban garage. He showed that you didn't always need to spend 4 hours hand-cutting a mortise and tenon if a few wooden biscuits and some glue could do the job in 10 minutes. However, as the show's success grew, so did the size of the machinery. This is where the power versus purity debate really heated up. Purists, the woodworkers who believed that if you aren't using a hand-sharpened Japanese pull saw, you aren't really crafting, began to grumble. They looked at the time-saver wide-belt sander, a machine the size of a small refrigerator that could sand a tabletop to perfection in seconds, and felt the soul was being sucked out of the hobby. To them, Norm was becoming less of a craftsman and more of a factory foreman. The introduction of the sliding table saw was another flashpoint. This wasn't your father's craftsman table saw. This was a massive, industrial-grade piece of European engineering that took up half the shop. For the average viewer living in a 3-bedroom ranch with a 1-car garage, these tools were becoming increasingly aspirational rather than practical. There was a segment of the audience that felt the show was moving away from how-to and toward look at what I have. They missed the early days when Norm would struggle with a handheld router rather than dropping a piece of oak into a dedicated stationary shaper. But to view the power shift as a negative is to miss the point of Norm's philosophy. Norm wasn't a snob, he was a production carpenter. His background was in building houses where time is money and accuracy is everything. To him, a tool was a means to an end. If a $2,000 drum sander meant he could spend more time on the design and less time on the drudgery of hand sanding, he took that deal every time. He was teaching efficiency. He was showing the world that handmade didn't have to mean slow and painful. He democratized professional results for people who had limited weekend hours to spend in their shops. Furthermore, Norm's use of these tools sparked a revolution in the tool industry itself. Seeing the demand Norm created, companies like Delta, Porter Cable, and Bessie, those iconic red-handled clamps, began to develop prosumer versions of industrial tools. The high-quality tools available at big-box retailers today are a direct result of the bar Norm set. He demanded accuracy and repeatability, and the manufacturers stepped up to meet the Yankee standard. Even the controversial tools, like the CNC-adjacent jigs or the specialized tenoning jigs, served a purpose. They lowered the barrier to entry. Norm proved that with the right jig and a bit of safety-first common sense, a novice could produce a highboy that looked like it belonged in a museum. He wasn't just selling tools, he was selling the confidence to use them. Whether you loved the big machines or longed for the days of the hand chisel, you couldn't deny that Norm's tool wall was the North Star of the industry. But all the machinery in the world is useless and potentially deadly if you don't follow the most important rule of all, a mantra that saved countless fingers and became a piece of television history. Safety first, and the technical gospel. If there is one phrase that has been parodied, celebrated, and memed more than any other in the history of DIY television, it is the safety first monologue. Every single episode, without fail, Norm would pause to deliver his sermon on eye and ear protection. Before we use any power tools, let's take a moment to talk about shop safety. He'd begin, adjusting his goggles. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. It was more than just a legal disclaimer to keep WGBH from being sued. It was the bedrock of his technical gospel. In a world of spinning blades and high-torque motors, Norm made safety cool by making it professional. Norm's technical approach was grounded in the carpentry school of furniture making. This is a critical distinction that set him apart from the fine woodworking elite. Traditionalists often scoffed at his reliance on power tools, but Norm's brilliance lay in his project life cycle. He pioneered a 3-stage system that turned complex 18th-century heirlooms into manageable weekend tasks. First came the prototype. Norm would build the entire project in his own time, often using cheaper secondary woods like pine or poplar. This was where he made his mistakes, refined his jigs, and figured out the exact order of operations. The second stage was the measured drawings. By the time the cameras rolled, the project had been reverse engineered into a set of blueprints that were sold to viewers. This was the secret sauce of the show's longevity. It wasn't just entertainment, it was an educational product. The third stage was the production phase, the actual filming. Because Norm had already built the piece once, his movements on screen were fluid and decisive. He never hesitated. He never looked at a piece of wood and wondered, "What now?" This gave the show a rhythmic, hypnotic quality. He demystified the black box of craftsmanship by showing that success was simply the result of preparation and a sharp blade. Norm's techniques were built on the pillars of accuracy and repeatability. He was a master of the jig. If a project required 4 identical tapered legs, Norm wouldn't freehand them. He would spend 10 minutes building a dedicated jig that ensured every leg was a perfect clone of the first. To the purists, this felt like cheating. To the average guy in a suburban garage with limited time, it was a revelation. He taught us that the tool is only as good as the setup. He championed the measure twice, cut once lifestyle, but he added a Yankee twist. Measure 3 times, build a jig, and then you only have to cut once forever. His approach to joinery was equally pragmatic. While he could hand-cut a dovetail with the best of them, he was far more likely to reach for a router and a dovetail jig. He understood that for most of his audience, the goal wasn't the process of cutting, it was the result of having a beautiful chest of drawers in the bedroom. He shifted the focus from the romance of the hand tool to the triumph of the finished product. He taught a generation that perfect is the enemy of done, but that done should still be high quality. By stripping away the elitism of fine woodworking, he invited everyone into the shop, regardless of their skill level. When the saws finally stopped humming in 2009, many wondered if the master carpenter would simply vanish. But where did the sawdust actually settle for Norm Abram? Where the sawdust settled. When the final episode of Season 21 wrapped, many fans expected Norm Abram to disappear into a quiet retirement, perhaps spending his days fly fishing or building rocking chairs for a growing brood of grandchildren. But the master carpenter wasn't quite ready to hang up his tool belt for good. For over a decade following the show's conclusion, Norm remained a steady presence on this old house, acting as the elder statesman of American home renovation. However, in 2022, the transition became official. During a special tribute titled "The House That Norm Built," the industry gathered to give him a standing ovation as he officially stepped away from the cameras. Today, Norm lives a private life. While the internet is occasionally plagued by death hoaxes or sensationalized clickbait about his health, the reality is far more dignified. He is a man who gave 40 years to the public, and he has earned the right to his privacy. He reportedly spends time in his own personal workshop, one without cameras, lighting rigs, or producers, building things at his own pace. His legacy, however, has undergone a massive digital renaissance. For years after the show ended, the episodes were difficult to find, relegated to aging DVD sets or fuzzy bootlegs on early video sites. But recently, the brand has seen a rebirth. The official New Yankee Workshop website and YouTube channel have begun uploading high-definition restorations of the classic episodes. This move has introduced Norm to a generation that wasn't even born when the show first aired. Gen Z woodworkers, tired of the fast furniture culture of IKEA, are discovering Norm's methodical pacing and finding it incredibly soothing, a form of ASMR for the DIY soul. But the world Norm left behind has changed. The new class of woodworking content creators on platforms like YouTube and TikTok looks very different from the PBS model. Modern creators like Rex Kruger, 731 Woodworks, or April Wilkerson have to be their own directors, editors, and marketing teams. They often rely on clickbait titles and high-energy editing to survive the algorithm, a far cry from Norm's slow, steady, safety-first intros. Yet, if you look closely at their shops, you'll see the DNA of the New Yankee Workshop everywhere. You'll see the shop-built jigs, the dedicated assembly tables, and the ubiquitous flannel shirts that serve as a nod to the king. The competing channels of today aren't on television. They are digital communities. While Norm was a singular voice of authority, today's woodworkers benefit from a chorus of different perspectives. You have the hand tool-only purists who have finally found their niche, and the CNC/laser tech heads who represent the next frontier. But even in this fragmented landscape, Norm remains the common ancestor. Almost every major woodworking YouTuber cites Norm as their original inspiration. He was the one who proved that you could build a career and a community around the simple act of making something well. Is there still a place for a man in a flannel shirt in an age of 3D printers and AI-driven design? The answer lies in the comment sections of those remastered episodes. People aren't just there for the dimensions of a bedside table. They are there for the philosophy. They are there to be reminded that some things take time, that precision matters, and that there is a deep, primal satisfaction in turning a rough board into a finished work of art. The afterlife of the new Yankee workshop isn't just about the archives. It's about the millions of garage doors that still open every Saturday morning, inspired by a man who taught us that we could build it ourselves. Does the world still need a man in a flannel shirt in an age of 3D printers and CNC machines, or is the dad-core nostalgia the only thing keeping the flame alive? Why we'll never outgrow the workshop. The enduring public love for the new Yankee workshop isn't just about nostalgia or dad-core aesthetics. It's about a fundamental human need for tangible competence. In a modern economy where so much of our work is abstract, moving data across screens, attending endless meetings, and navigating the ephemeral cloud, Norm Abram represented the anchor of the physical world. He was the man who could take a raw pile of timber and, through a series of logical, repeatable steps, transform it into something that would outlive us all. This is why, even in an age of 3D printers and automated CNC machines, the show remains the ultimate comfort food of television. The show's lasting impact can be seen in the very fabric of American suburban life. The growth of big-box DIY stores like Home Depot and Lowe's in the 90s and 2000s happened in lockstep with Norm's rise. He gave people the permission to believe they could handle a router, and in doing so, he helped build an entire industry. But more than that, he provided a blueprint for how to be a professional without being a prima donna. He proved that you could be the best in the world at your craft while remaining humble, wearing a stained shirt, and focusing entirely on the work rather than the fame. Today, the new Yankee spirit lives on in the maker movement. It's in the teenager building a skateboard deck in their garage, and the retiree finally buying that lathe they saw Norm use in 1994. The show taught us that while the tools might get more sophisticated and the fashion might change, the core principles of patience, safety, and respect for the material are timeless. We don't just watch Norm to learn how to build a table. We watch him to remember what it looks like to be a person who takes pride in their labor. As we look back at the quiet end of the workshop in 2009, it's clear that the barn doors didn't really shut. They just moved. They moved into our garages, our basements, and our hearts. Norm Abram might be enjoying a well-earned rest, but every time someone measures twice, cuts once, and puts on their safety glasses, the new Yankee workshop is open for business. Have you seen one of the episodes? Comment below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more.